Today we're going to go over some key concepts in world history that you would have learned last year, and we're going to practice taking notes on vocabulary in the process. Now, to learn vocabulary in social studies, you need to do a couple of things. First, you need to actively think about the meaning of the words that you see, and if you don't understand what they mean, you need to stop and look them up or ask questions. Vocabulary is really like the building block of everything else that we do. So if you don't understand the words, that's where all of your focus needs to be first. To learn new words in social studies, there are two things that you can do that work really great. Number one, draw them. It sounds silly, but often we learn about kind of complicated concepts like specialization or ideology. It's pretty easy to copy down a definition without actually understanding it. It's a lot harder to draw the idea of the word, but if you can successfully do that, then not only do you actually understand the concept, but you're probably going to remember it a lot better too. There's some examples up on the slide. You'll see on the top right, that was a student's note card for the word specialization, which means developing skills that take time and training to learn. You could memorize the definition, but if you really know it, you can draw it too. So drawing is key. That's what I recommend for everybody. And actually it's required in this class, not a recommendation. The second thing that you can do to learn vocabulary, if you want to really master all of these words, is don't just pay attention to the definition, but think about how each word is similar to, but especially different from other closely related vocabulary words. So if we're learning about like animals and you want to know what a dog is, you don't only have to write down the definition for dog, you also have to think about how dogs are different from like cats and hamsters and bunnies and stuff like that. So those are my two tips. You do that, you are in good shape. Also, drawing for these purposes, to draw to learn, like the artistic quality of what you produce doesn't matter at all. It's the process of taking something that you learn in words and thinking about it in pictures that really does it for memory and understanding. So if you're not the best artist in the world, it doesn't matter. Draw things that are ugly. It'll still work just as well for my class. The first set of words that we have to master to even begin to access this class have to do with just history, the business of history, studying it. Primary sources are pieces of evidence, often written, from the past that historians use to create narratives or stories about the past, our understanding of the past, and to create secondary sources. These are as close to eyewitness accounts as we can get. So for example, if we're studying ancient Rome, Julius Caesar's diary, which would have been written during the time of ancient Rome, is a primary source. On the pictures, you'll see actually a copy of Christopher Columbus's diary. If we're looking at the discovery of the Americas, that's a primary source. It's the first place we should go to get a sense of what the past was like, because it tells us about the past from the perspective of the people who were there. Secondary sources are indirect evidence, where primary sources are direct evidence of the past from the time. Secondary sources are narratives written about the past long after the fact, mostly by historians, ideally, that are used for reference to give us like a big picture overview of what the time was like. To compose secondary sources, we're relying on historians' interpretations of primary sources. So often you're going to want to read several secondary sources if you want to get a really good, less biased perspective of the past. A great example of a secondary source is a textbook. It wasn't written back in the day at the time that you're trying to learn about. It was written way more recently by some guy who's trying to teach you about that time in the past, or some girl. Also, books created by historians, way better than textbooks, in my opinion, are secondary sources. They're narratives of the past. So on the slide, we have a fantastic book called 1493 by the historian Charles C. Mann about the new worlds that Columbus created after he arrived in the Americas. Bias. Often we hear the word bias in an extremely negative context, and for good reason. But really, it just means prejudice in favor or against a specific viewpoint. Bias can be conscious. You might be aware that you have biases. You might not be. They might just be a product of the time and place that you were raised in, right? So like in teaching world geography, I very quickly got the sense that my students had a very strong bias towards this idea that people throughout history should have been able to make their own choices. They were very surprised at how little people in the past were able to determine their own lives. That is a bias that comes from having lived in a country with a constitution that protects people's rights. The idea of freedom of speech, for example, is something that maybe we take for granted, but it hasn't always existed. So sometimes people are surprised that, like back in the day, you could get thrown in jail or killed or tortured for saying something mean about the ruler. Bias can also be a lot more negative, right? Like racism is a bias. It's a harmful, malicious thing. But everybody has biases. Everybody has specific points of view about any given topic that come just from having grown up the way they grew up. And because of this, it's really important to read lots of different sources about the past so that you can kind of cut through different people's bias to get a better sense of what the past was actually like. We have an entire field of study devoted to exactly this process, and it is called historiography. Circle that word because it's super important. Historiography. It's the study of how different historians, or different secondary sources, if you want to think of it that way, have told the story of a period in the past, how those stories are different, and why. So a very clear example would be if we're writing a history, or if we're studying World War II, specifically the Holocaust, we could pick up a book by a historian in modern day America, and we could pick up a second book by a historian who used to be a Nazi. They're going to come up with two very different stories about that one conflict. And even if they both stick really, really close to the sources, because of the ways that they are raised, because of the biases they have, they're going to see it very differently. So historiography studies those differences, like what do we know about this time in the past? And how have different people told that story? And how does that affect what we actually know about this time in the past? Columbus, again, to take an example that you guys are going to cover pretty shortly here. We have a federal holiday celebrating him. Some people hold him up as a hero. Most historians now see that he was an incredibly violent and kind of morally questionable person who, maybe his heroics were less intentional than Columbus Day would make them seem. This will make a little bit more sense once we get to that class. Anyway, like this debate as to whether Columbus should be considered a hero or a villain is part of the historiography of the discovery of the Americas. Next, we're going to talk about states and empires. First, empires are the bread and butter of world history class. Most of what we study in this class has to do with empires or effects of empires having done their thing. Empires are strong states that expand by conquest. But to even get to what that means, we need to understand a couple of other terms that you may or may not be familiar with. First, the word state. In social studies, a state is a territory ruled by a government with formal borders and laws. In day-to-day language, we call these countries probably. So the United States is actually a state. Mexico is a state. Canada is a state. France is a state. Russia, a state. The territories that we in the USA tend to call states, like Texas, for example, most people would actually call those provinces or districts. We call them states because they used to be independent and then they united into the United States. Anyway, so when you see the word state in this class, think country. It's a place with a formal border, like an official country, you'd see it on a map. Nations are groups of people with significant ethnic, or cultural ties that feel a sense of unity as a result of those connections. This is a tricky concept because a nation is an idea. It's not a physical place. And it's an idea based on things that are very much not tangible. You can't like see it on a map or like in the wild. But to give a pretty clear example, in the United States Civil War, a civil war happens when there are two nations, there are two groups of people within one state that feel like they do not belong together. They shouldn't be governed together. The South felt very different from the North and vice versa. So nations are ideas. Like I personally am Mexican, but I live in the United States and I am a United States citizen. But I feel strong ties to Mexico because that's where my people are from. So it can be kind of a confusing gray area. Nation states exist when the nation, the people with that feeling of commonality that comes from culture and history and maybe ethnicity, when a nation is represented by a formal government in a specific territory with formal borders. So if America is full of Americans and people who feel like they're Americans, it's a nation state. Empires are different. Empires are large states that form when one really, really strong state conquers weaker nations and absorbs them into their territory. Usually this happens for resources. Usually empires will give you much nicer sounding ideas that justify this kind of conquest. But conquering stuff, it's violent. It means like going where someone else lives, killing a bunch of people, taking their stuff, and claiming ownership over them and the place that you just conquered. So historically, these have appeared when a country with a really strong military takes over many other groups of people with different cultures, so different nations, and rules them by force. Therefore, empires contain lots of nations, because usually people who get conquered don't really feel very connected to the people who just killed a bunch of their friends and family members and took all of their stuff. All of that's to say, the two most important vocabulary words on this slide are state and empire. States are big territories with a formal border, recognized internationally. We call them countries often. Just, don't be confused when you see the word state. Empires are large, strong states that expand by conquest. Usually they're ruled centrally by an emperor, and they're very diverse because they involve the strong state having gobbled up a bunch of smaller, different nations. Social hierarchy is our next word that you need to know in order to be able to access this class. The social hierarchy is the division of society into different social classes based on power and wealth. The ruler, usually a king throughout history, is at the top. Just under the king, you get elites, so like the upper class. Sometimes you'll see these people called the nobles or the landed aristocracy. Those people are like usually rich, wealthy families that have connections in some way, shape, or form to the ruler that are pretty strong. You have bureaucrats, so like the people who do the business of government without actually having the power to make any rules themselves, like tax collectors and scribes and people who make the state work. And you get specialized classes of all sorts in the middle. So anybody who has special skills that take time and talent to master that especially are valuable to the upper classes are usually towards the middle of a social hierarchy. And at the very bottom, generally through history, you get masses of agricultural laborers, so like peasants, farmers, and slaves. Usually at the very bottom of the hierarchy are most of the population. Very few people get towards the top. These hierarchies and state power generally, through history, were most often sanctioned and legitimized by religion, meaning that like often the king will claim some sort of religious basis for his power. I'm king because God says I'm supposed to be. And hey, look over here, there's a priest who's also towards the top of the social hierarchy who says that this is true. And because you all believe in the same religion, you're going to believe me when I say it, is kind of how it worked. Legitimacy is the right of a ruler to have power over people as perceived by the people being ruled over, right? It's the answer to the question, who made you boss? Validity, right? So like often the people at the top of the hierarchy use religion to say like, I get to be up here, I get to tell you what to do. And, your religious beliefs say that this is true. And often throughout history that has worked. Usually also you'll find that the people at the top are the ones with the powers to make laws, and usually they make laws to protect their own prestige and power and property and stuff. Next, a really kind of interesting concept. You definitely learned about this last year, but we're going to go over it again because these two things tend to change in terms of how they're defined: civilization and barbarians. First, civilizations are complex societies defined by distinct cultures, rules, norms, and laws. There are lots of different definitions for a civilization. It's a controversial term. You can know them by like a combination of traits, right? They're settled societies that get their food from farming, with governments, hierarchy, specialization, trade systems, writing systems, organized religion, and so forth. What this word means and how it is used are slightly different. Often, civilizations, like Rome, for example, think of themselves as superior and advanced to the people who don't belong to their group. They view the people who don't follow the same rules, the same norms, the same laws, their kind of behavior, as being uncivilized or barbarians. Very controversial term in history. A barbarian is someone who is perceived to be uncivilized or who has traits that don't fit into civilized society, like excessive cruelty or inability to adapt to the way that the culture behaves normally. But the key here is perception. It's not fact. To give you an example, at school, we all behave according to a certain set of rules, whether we know them or not. Some of them are written down, like in the code of conduct. Some of them don't have to be written down because we all follow them. Those are called norms. For example, I don't know if it ever says in the code of conduct that everybody has to wear clothes to school, but, we do because it's expected, because that's how we behave. I don't know in the code of conduct that it says that everybody can't like vomit on each other all the time, but nobody does that because we're civilized. We don't behave that way. We follow certain rules, right? In order to make it possible to all be together in the same space without chaos. A barbarian would be somebody who doesn't follow those rules for whatever reason. So like, kid comes to school naked, we'd be like, whoa, he's uncivilized. What a barbarian. Also, go get some clothes on. In history, these words have been used a little differently. At the very beginning, when societies began to come together, the civilizations that developed farming and like settled down in one place looked down on nomadic civilizations as being barbaric. It doesn't mean that they were actually less sophisticated or less or inferior, right, to the civilized societies. That's just how the civilized saw them. These are tricky words because they're loaded with value judgments. The definitions using this like superiority idea tend to be excuses for civilizations to treat other people badly and often conquer them and take their stuff and kill a bunch of people. The Romans thought that they were super civilized with their laws and their roads and like their super fancy army. And so they conquered a lot of land using that civilization excuse. Like, we're bringing all of these advanced features to these barbarians who, maybe they didn't have amazing paved roads, but they were perfectly fine without Roman rule. So you have to be like super careful with these. And it's important in history to pay attention to how these words are used and defined. For example, even though at first the idea was like settled societies versus nomads, that's how people defined civilization and barbaric. Later in history, you'll see it defined based on religion. Like if you belong to my religion, you're civilized. If you don't, you're a barbarian and I get to kill you and take your stuff. And our last concept is cultural diffusion, describing the movement of one culture's cultural traits to another, often along long-distance trade routes. So when resources, ideas, religions, technology, and even diseases move from one civilization to the next, that's cultural diffusion. Often this happens along trade because throughout history, before modern technology, people who traded goods long distance were the people who like physically moved from one civilization to the next, carrying ideas and technology and disease with them. And you will see more of this in today's classwork.